What is going on, guys? It is the Awesemo NBA strategy show for Yahoo, talking about tonight's Yahoo slate 6 games. Now, I just did a strategy show with Adam Scher, talking mostly about the FanDuel and DraftKings slates. And you would think it's the same show, but not quite, because not only are we talking about Yahoo, but we've got new news that just came across that could really shake up the slate in the first game of the night. The Toronto Raptors have downgraded both Pascal Siakam and Fred VanVleet to questionable. So that is something that Matt Savoca and I are going to be talking about just shortly when we launch into talking about these games. Like the video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, guys. Matt, what's going on? How's your weekend going?
Hey, having a great weekend so far. Thrilled to be here. My first time on the Yahoo NBA show. Yeah, an exciting slate here, and it might have gotten switched up. The first thing I noticed when I looked at the Awesemo projections today was our initial run of projections had Fred VanVleet pegged at 37 minutes, and I was like, hold on a minute. Hold on. Wait a minute. Are we even sure he's going to play? And now we got the Siakam news. This could change things up, but I'm excited to dig in today.
Yeah, so it seems here's kind of my read on everything now. The things shouldn't be correlated, but the first week of the best ball playoffs started this week. So we've got DraftKings first week of best ball playoffs, Underdog first week best ball playoffs. And I was sitting really well heading into the playoffs. I got through like 75% of my teams on Underdog. I got through about 50% on DraftKings. I'm feeling really good. Every single player that I'm highly exposed to not playing right now. Darius Garland, Pascal Siakam. So, of course, he gets downgraded to questionable. My point being that I just assume anybody that I'm heavily exposed to in best ball that gets downgraded to questionable won't play to screw me over. So that's kind of my feel. Because I'm looking through my teams this morning. I'm like, all right, who's still looking good? Because I had a bunch of Garland. He's been out. Porzingis hasn't been playing. Chris Paul had a lot of leading the league in assists. He's injured now. So my teams have totally gone to shambles. And now, of course, Pascal Siakam.
It's like that sometimes with best ball, especially. It's like it's a war of attrition. So I shouldn't say that. Just you got to stay healthy. You got to stay healthy for the longest in best ball sometimes because you can't make any changes.
Well, it was looking good for a little bit, and I'm going to turn a profit on it. But I was sitting here a couple of weeks ago going, boy, I have a real chance to take some first place prize on Underdog and DraftKings. Not the case anymore, unless just something sneaks through and ends up being the nuts. I don't have nearly as many bullets right now because of this Raptors situation in particular that we could start by talking about. And as is, this team is already without OG Anunoby. So we knew they were going to be shorthanded coming into the game. We knew yesterday also Anunoby was going to be out. This Raptors team just got their asses kicked yesterday. Blowout, really one-sided game. Now we have Siakam questionable and Fred VanVleet questionable. So let's just start by looking at it this way, Matt, because I think there's probably a little bit of a correlation here. I tend to think if VanVleet sits, Siakam will also sit. I think one of them plays, they both play. If there is no Siakam and no VanVleet in addition to OG Anunoby being out, who steps up and becomes the top guys to roster from Toronto on Yahoo tonight?
I mean, I guess we're talking about Gary Trent and Scotty Barnes, right? I don't know. I mean, Ken Birch probably just picks up more production sort of by osmosis, but you know, it almost becomes a situation where nobody becomes that exciting in this game. If we can't project Toronto to be able to do what they typically do, then we can't really rely on any historical data. If so many players are out at once, that's when things get really volatile, really wonky. I'm not going to say that, you know, Trent is going to jack up shots most likely, and Barnes is going to pick up plenty of production, but it almost makes me downgrade the entire team and just make me look elsewhere.
Yeah, so for me, this would be the team I get the most exposure to if there's no Siakam and VanVleet. You know, as is, I already like Scotty Barnes, Gary Trent less so, but I'd be looking at a situation where I probably have Scotty Barnes pegged for like 42 minutes, Gary Trent potentially maybe even more than that, because we've seen Nick Nurse really likes to run a tight rotation, and I don't really think that changes if players are out. It just means there's different guys getting those minutes. We don't have to go that far back to see Gary Trent went on a stretch at the end of January, early February. Here are his minutes played for this stretch of games: 56, 41, 41, 40. Obviously, the 56, that was a double overtime game. That wasn't in regulation. Very difficult.
He'll get that plenty.
Yeah, even with Nick Nurse's insane rotations, hard to play 56 minutes in a 48-minute regulation game. But I think that's what we could pretty safely project is for Scotty Barnes and Gary Trent to both play over 40 minutes if these players are out. The only caveat being is if the game is competitive, because, you know, you start to take some of these players like Siakam and VanVleet off the court, and who knows if the Raptors are able to keep the game close or not. But I do think that there's massive amounts of potential for minutes here. And another guy too, Thad Young. The Raptors have not played Thad Young that much since the trade deadline, and I don't really understand it because they invested a first-round pick to trade for Thad Young. And this is one of the sharper front offices in the NBA. It's hard for me to think that Masai Ujiri went out, swapped a first-round pick for Thad Young with the plan to not play him. I think that Thad Young just hasn't played that much this year. Maybe his conditioning wasn't in check. He wasn't that familiar with the system. Now that he has a few games under his belt, he's played over 20 minutes in back-to-back games. I think there is a chance if Siakam and VanVleet are out for Thad Young to enter the starting lineup and play like 36 minutes. So he would become my favorite value play in that situation. But now I'm going to ask you on the flip side, if Siakam and VanVleet both do play, what do you make of them then?
Yeah, I think VanVleet is a strong play. Honestly, if the Awesemo projections, which are incredibly solid, are correct, we still have him in for 36 minutes here. I don't know if we're really going to see that, but if he does, then I actually really like him a lot. Honestly, this team was one of the teams I was kind of leaning on in a game that I expect to have, you know, plenty of production, plenty of scoring here, but I really liked VanVleet. You know, I don't know what to expect here. This is just really tough for me when it feels like this is all last minute news, but the way I was building my lineups earlier, VanVleet was all over the place. I'll tell you that.
Yeah, and Van Vliet, another guy who's been playing a massive role. And last couple games, I think we have to consider outliers and take them out of the mix. Last night's game was a blowout. They ended up losing by, was it like 37 points or something like that, the Raptors did. So we have to take the minutes with a grain of salt. The starters didn't really play in the fourth quarter. The game before that, Fred Van Vliet was out. The game before that, he got injured during the game. So let's look at the minutes when he was actually healthy. 38, 36, 38, 39, 42, 39, 39, 54, 42, 39, 42, 41, 42, 42, 44. He plays massive minutes. If anything, I think there's a case for maybe that 36 is maybe even a short projection.
Conservative.
Should he be healthy? I know it's uncomfortable to maybe project some of these guys for 40 minutes, but I actually have Siakam personally project for 40 minutes if he's in today. So the Raptors like to play their guys big minutes. We just have to know who's playing for them today, which we won't know until later. So check out the deeper dive and live before lock, guys, because that is when we're going to have a better feel for this Raptors situation, which now seems like it's pretty likely to be the most important situation on the entire slate. Let's move on to the other side of the game where the Atlanta Hawks are going to be at home playing a potentially shorthanded Toronto Raptors team. The big injury news here, John Collins out for the Atlanta Hawks. Lou Williams is also out. That is less of an importance to it. Yep. With John Collins out of the mix, we've seen the minutes a little more stabilized for Clint Capella. And while he's been priced up on sites like FanDuel and DraftKings, the $23 price tag to me is still pretty appealing on Yahoo. So Matt, what do you make of Clint Capella, or is there somebody else in the front court that stands out to you from Atlanta?
Nope, you took the words right out of my mouth. First player that really sticks out to me, obviously $40 Trae Young. I'm not going to complain about it. It's not my absolute favorite, but you can go there. Clint Capella, $23. We got him at a solid boom percentage. Actually, the second highest center in terms of boom percentage on the boom bust tool on Yahoo. We got it projected for nearly 28 minutes, which would be 3.5 minutes more than his last 10 game average. And that's obviously because Collins is out. But as you said, the stabilization of the playing time leads to a stabilization of the production. He is my definite top value on this team. DeAndre Hunter at $13, kind of interesting to me. Kevin Huerter at 14. I don't hate it, but they're not superstar plays for me at all. Capella is definitely the value I'm looking at.
Yeah, the situation with the Hawks wings is really weird because the minutes are all over the place. And at any point in time, one of these guys could pop for some upside, and they're all really cheap on Yahoo. You just mentioned there, DeAndre Hunter is only $13. He played limited minutes what was it, 2 nights ago now? I'm trying to figure out what the date was for that game as I'm pulling up the box.
I believe it was.
Yeah, so it was 2 nights ago. Kevin Huerter, DeAndre Hunter only played 13 minutes, but he got sick during the game, had to leave, wasn't able to continue. Bogdanovich started the second half in his place. So I still think DeAndre Hunter is the guy that we should project for the most fantasy points amongst this trio of wings, Danilo Gallinari, DeAndre Hunter, and Kevin Huerter. I can't feel super confident in any of them. I think all of them are low-level GPP plays that if you're playing multiple lineups, it's worth getting some exposure to. I think we've kind of gone through everybody that's pertinent from the Hawks here, but anything else stand out to you?
Not really. Yeah, as you said, the only player with more than a 10% boom percentage is DeAndre Hunter on the wings. Bogdanovich only a 5% boom percentage. So it's really Capella, Trae Young, a little bit of Hunter. That's pretty much it.
All right, let's move on to the next game then, which is the Washington Wizards on the road against the Cleveland Cavaliers. And I got Adam's take on this early, and I'm curious to hear what you say about it as well, because we have 2 games today that are impacted in the exact same way. And 2 teams. Last night, the Washington Wizards played the San Antonio Spurs, a game that was really high scoring, also went to double overtime. Now, both these teams, I assume fatigue is going to be an issue for Washington and San Antonio. Right now, we're talking about the Washington-Cleveland game. But we just saw this team have to play all of the regular guys a massive amount of minutes. So pulling up the box score from last night, we had Kyle Kuzma play 46 minutes. Kentavious Caldwell-Pope played 43. Hotwell Neto played 37. Denny Avdia played 37. Kispert played 31. Daniel Gafford, who's been playing limited minutes for most of the season, played 28. Is any of this a concern for you? It's a tough matchup against Cleveland, but this is the tail end of a back-to-back on the road, double overtime game where they played big minutes last night. Does that change how you view these Washington Wizards players at all?
Well, not to mention the fact that the front court is still struggling with injuries. Porzingis already ruled out. So to see this Washington team play so much and be shorthanded in the front court against basically the biggest team in the league with Markkanen, Allen, and Mobley in the front court, I mean, getting wiped here is totally in the range of outcomes for Washington. If you're going to get huge amounts of minutes, I'm still interested in a player like Kuzma. We've got him projected for 35 minutes, and that's probably conservative as we're talking about. But honestly, this Washington team, really what it does is almost the same exact situation as Toronto. We're adding ingredients to the volatility of their projections. So when we look at Awesemo.com's median projections, we're thinking that's the most likely outcome. But because of yesterday, you have to say that the chances of getting to that most likely outcome are lowered for all Washington players. I'm not really bullish on many of these players at all today.
Yeah, and the only player that I have projected super well from a points per dollar perspective, Kyle Kuzma, $33 in general. He's shown to have a high upside. And I've already said multiple times, mea culpa, I take a loss for making fun of Kyle Kuzma all year. I think he's played fairly well this season, but he's up to $33 in a plus match a bit in Cleveland. I just think that price is about appropriate. If Daniel Gafford starts again, I think he's a pretty appealing center option just because he is the flat min. What his minutes are going to look like on the tail end of a back-to-back, I'm not totally sure, but something else to consider. Thomas Bryant is coming back from ACL surgery. They've been pretty cautious with him. And it's a thing also where he sprained an ankle, was it 2 weeks ago now, and had to miss some time. So I don't know if they want to play Thomas Bryant big minutes. And then you just get to a situation where, hey, Gafford's a pretty good fantasy producer, could start at $10. I think he's the best overall points per dollar play on Washington. Do you agree with that? Or is there somebody else that you would play if you had to roster one Washington Wizard? Who would it be?
No, it's him. We got Ish Smith at $10 with an 11% boom percentage. Sure. If you want to make him your value play so you can get up to superstars, I get it. He's not incredibly appealing, but yeah, probably in the front court. I just don't know when you have so many minutes played. Gafford is probably the best bet, but I could see it going wrong as well.
All right, let's hit on the Cleveland Cavaliers side of the game. And as of now, I think without much doubt, the best value play on the slate is Brandon Goodwin, because this is the current backcourt situation for the Cleveland Cavaliers. Darius Garland out because he's on my best ball teams. Like I said before, that has massive impact on whether these guys are able to play or not. Karis LeVert out. He has a foot injury. He's probably not playing for the next couple weeks or so. So last game, we have Rajon Rondo move into the starting lineup, become a chalk play. What happens? He gets hurt. Now he's not expected to play for a considerable amount of time, probably out for about a month or so. That left Brandon Goodwin as the only available point guard for the Cleveland Cavaliers. So they went out, they signed Tim Frazier to a 10-day contract. I expect him to be in the rotation, play a dozen minutes or so, but he's not even in the player pool, so we don't have him as an option. Here's the question when it comes to Brandon Goodwin. $11, clearly a terrific value play, but he's also expected to be the most popular play on the slate by a really wide margin. So considering all the information we know about Brandon Goodwin, how do you approach him in tournaments?
I'm probably fading him. I might have a little bit of him, but there's no need, especially on Yahoo, where salary is a little bit less of a concern. Yes, it's great to get 30 projected minutes on a team that could, handle their opponent. And, we're just not getting that type of projected volume and fantasy production from a player who's $11 in salary. That's rare. I get it. But I think one of the easiest ways to differentiate yourself on the slate is just by being way under the field. I'm not going to make some sort of rule where I can't have Brandon Goodwin, but there are just so many ways this goes wrong. And the production for Cleveland comes from elsewhere that in cash games, fine, but in tournaments, I'm going to be way under the field.
Do you see anybody as a direct pivot to Brandon Goodwin? There's no leverage to be had here because honestly, I actually thought lastly, Brandon Goodwin made some potential sense as a leverage play off of Rajon Rondo. We can't do that today because Tim Frazier isn't even in the player pool. And I know we're kind of venturing outside of just looking at one individual game, but what do you see as the way to get off of Brandon Goodwin? Is there another guard you like for cheap, or is it just a situation where you're saying, maybe I'll have more lineups that I'm just building in the mid-range and it's less stars and scrubs?
Yeah, it's more the latter, to be honest. It's one of those situations where in Fantasy Cruncher, I'll just limit the exposure based on the projected ownership at Awesemo.com and then just see how it differentiates my lineups from what the expectations are. It's kind of that simple in the NBA because we do have players so similar in production and then projection compared to salary-based expectations can be razor thin. So just by lowering my ownership of a player like Goodwin, I can differentiate myself fine on this slate.
And now let's talk about some of the other players on the Cleveland Cavaliers, because once again, potential favorable matchup against a Washington Wizards team that not only is shorthanded in the front court, but also I would assume to be pretty fatigued after the game yesterday. We've got guys like Jared Allen, Evan Mobley, Kevin Love, Lauri Markkanen, all individually have pretty high upside, but sometimes it's hard to point out who the individual player could be that's going to go off on any given night. But is there any one player in the front court for Cleveland that you'd think does stand out above the rest?
Uh, and that's pretty tough. It really is razor thin. I think Kevin Love's $16 salary is pretty appealing. I think Mobley is probably still the most likely to perform at his ceiling here if we're trying to take down a GPP. We got him projected for 35 minutes, a solid 1 fantasy point per minute projection. And that's really right where he's been over his last 5 games. He's been 1.02 fantasy points per minute, 0.98 over his last 10. Obviously Jared Allen, really, really solid player. If you told me at the end of the night that Allen way outperformed Mobley, we're not surprised there. But if I'm taking a stab at one, I'll say Mobley.
Yeah, I agree. I have Jared Allen projected for more fantasy points, but with that said, he's only center eligible over on Yahoo. Evan Mobley is power forward eligibility. So same price. I have more projected fantasy points for Jared Allen, but just because of positionality, I think it's a little bit easier to get to Evan Mobley. You can play him in power forward, you can play him in forward or the utility spot. Jared Allen, you can only play in center or utility, and center is always a loaded position on Yahoo. So it's one that I generally find it hard, unless it's somebody like Jokic, who we're going to talk about later, that there just aren't usually that many guys to like a $30 Jared Allen that I'm really going to be gravitating towards. Any other talking points for you in this game? If not, we could move on.
I think we can move on.
All right. By the way, I should also mention, if you guys want access to any of the tools that Matt and I are talking about here, stuff like Matt's talking about players' boom bust rating and their odds to be in the optimal lineup, you can get access to that for as low as $4.95 for an NBA weekly pass. But even better than that, if you guys haven't signed up for Yahoo yet, you could do it using the link in the description box below. Sign up for Yahoo for the first time using that link, make a deposit, enter a contest, and you get 1 free month of Awesemo Plus Platinum, where you get behind the paywall and see all of this stuff. All our tools, projections, ownership projections, and you don't have to do it you can do it without paying even the $4.95 cost. So good way to get in the door and sign up for Yahoo at the same time. Let's hit on this next game now. And it's the exact same talking point, Matt. San Antonio Spurs against the Miami Heat. The Spurs were playing that game against the Wizards that went to double overtime last night. And I have to assume they are equally fatigued, if not even more fatigued, because we saw some of these guys just have to log such heavy minutes. One in particular, DeJounte Murray, a guy who you and I both liked quite a bit yesterday when we did the Locks Before Locks show. He ended up having a massive, massive fantasy game. But how are his legs going to feel after he played all those minutes yesterday? Because pulling up the box score from that game and looking at it from the Spurs side, he played 43 minutes. Jakob Poeltl played 41 minutes. Keldon Johnson, 46. Devin Vassell, 42. Doug McDermott, 27. Lonnie Walker, 35. I got so lucky yesterday with Lonnie Walker, man. I played a bunch of them in tournaments. Sucked. Did nothing in regulation. But then he just kind of had to play overtime because guys were fatigued, and he scores a bunch of points in overtime to get there. No business having a good game. But that's the way the dice roll sometimes. Sometimes you get lucky in your favor. Sometimes it goes against you. How much do you think fatigue is going to impact the San Antonio Spurs, who they played even heavier minutes than the Wizards played their guys yesterday?
So this is where my feelings about basketball differ from what the math says on Awesemo.com. And, obviously we don't have a how do the players' legs feel variable in our sports betting model. But our sports betting model actually says that the Spurs +9 right now is by far the best bet against the spread that there is on this entire slate. So if you're looking at it from that lens, and obviously our sports betting model will influence how our NBA projections go, then maybe I'm overweighting that, thinking that I'm in agreement with you. I saw the Spurs play tons of minutes and then basically looked wiped in overtime, to the point where, as you said, they're playing other players. But still, if that's what we're seeing for San Antonio, I'm not seeing the spread like it's 7.5 in some places, but if they're going to go that way, then I'm going to play plenty of DeJounte Murray again. I'm going to play plenty of Poeltl. Keldon Johnson at $21, I don't hate. It's not my favorite. And again, like I said, for these other teams, increase their variability when looking at median projection, but don't count them out at all.
And one other thing to mention here, Josh Richardson, Josh Primo, neither of them played yesterday. That opened up additional minutes on the wing. Was also one of the reasons they had to play these guys such heavy minutes, is because without Richardson and Primo active, they just did not have other guys to go to. It was the worst possible scenario for the Spurs to end up playing in a double overtime game. If Richardson and Primo end up returning today, then there's just going to be less playing time going to guys like Keldon Johnson, Devin Vassell, Lonnie Walker. So we'll have to see where the injuries shake out for the Spurs side of the game. Now, jumping over to the Miami Heat, we do have an injury here that's not all that pressing, but Dwayne Dedmon is questionable to play. In his absence, we saw Bam Adebayo, a little bit of an uptick. Omer Yurtseven played the backup center minutes. So if Dedmon's back, if they go back to the rotation they were playing before, maybe it's a minute or two less for Bam Adebayo. Yurtseven also kind of falls out of the rotation entirely. But what do you make of the Miami Heat team as is against a really potentially fatigued San Antonio Spurs team? We've got some reasonable pricing here. Bam Adebayo, $35, 39 for Jimmy Butler, 26 for Lowry, 25 for Hero. Do any of these Heat players really stand out to you?
Yeah, Bam and Jimmy Butler do. Absolutely. Jimmy Butler, interestingly enough, in that 15-point win against the Knicks last night, the only Heat starter who had a negative plus minus, still ended up with 22 points, contributed in other ways as well. He's got a 27% chance, 27% boom percentage. That's a good percentage on Yahoo. And Bam has a 20% as well. So those are the ones that really stick out. Kyle Lowry, a decent value. He's got an 11.1% boom percentage, and at $26, a decent median projection. But really, I honestly think it just solidifies Bam's minutes. And I'm surprised to see him have just 32 and a half projected minutes on Awesemo.com. That's actually a minute less than his average over the last 10 starts for him. And I kind of read it like you, that I kind of just see a less variability in Bam's minutes projection than I typically would if Dedmon was a full go.
Yeah, it just depends if Dedmon's in there or not ultimately. Because like you said, we've seen those increased minutes for Bam Adebayo, but it's correlated with Dwayne Dedmon being out. So could end up playing a couple less minutes if Dedmon is back in the mix. As for the role players on the Heat, it's just not that hard to find value on Yahoo. And we generally see a lot of guys like, Brandon Goodwin, who's $11 when he shouldn't be. Compare that to him being $5,400 on FanDuel. It's just, vastly different pricing. We don't really need to go to guys like PJ Tucker, $13. Duncan Robinson, $12. So none of these guys appeal to me. Do you feel any differently about the lesser role players for Miami?
3-point shooters can get hot and score well above their median projection, but there's nothing really that stands out that says this is the night they do it.
Yeah, that's where I'm at too. And I mean, I don't even know that some of these guys have that much upside, especially because somebody like Duncan Robinson, the minutes have generally not been there for him as of late. And part of the reason, too, is this Heat team has been banged up for a lot of the season, and there have not been very many times. I don't know off the top of my head how many games it is, but Hero, Lowry, Butler, Adebayo, off the top of my head, there's only been 7 games or so that all 4 of them have been active for, and they all are tonight, which makes it pretty hard to give all that much production to anybody else in a projection standpoint. Any other talking points for you for the Miami Heat here, San Antonio Spurs, or are you good to move on?
I think Miami, honestly, just the way I was looking at it, forgetting what the Awesemo sports betting model says, I think Miami could just crush here.
Yeah, I would not be surprised by that whatsoever. But let's jump and talk about some of the sports betting stuff a little bit. And I'm going to pull up Odd Shopper here just because I've already talked about all these games on a game by game basis. I want to mix it up a little bit, Matt. So let's try to find some bets that we were like for today. And it's something that you and I have been doing on our new Locks Before Lock show, which is going to be on weekdays, 30-minute time slot before Deeper Dive, before Live, before Lock. So we got sports betting becoming legal in a lot of places. We have Odd Shopper. It's a free tool to use that helps identify some of the best player prop numbers. So what it does is it takes our NBA projections, our simulations, and it just based on the results of those simulations finds out the best expected win rates, expected ROIs for all of the player props out there relative to what's being offered at all the different sports books. So I'm pulling this up right here just to look at some of the numbers that are appealing. And here's one thing that stands out to me right away. These are the kind of numbers that I've been on quite a bit as of late, and they seem dumb, but they just are not really being calibrated properly by sportsbooks, in my opinion. See DeMar DeRozan here. Over 0.5 blocks is plus 290. And these are the numbers that we've seen a lot of lately, where it'll be like, oh, we've got this guy who, for the year, he averages, let's see, about 0.3 blocks per game this year for DeMar DeRozan. Not a massive number. And we only have him projected for 0.4 blocks. But still, you have to think the odds of him getting a block, it's happening according to our model 35% of the time. Not super frequently, but 35% means the plus 290 number is way off. So some of these numbers, even if it isn't super likely to be an individual outcome, the odds are just too long. So something that stands out to me now that we've added the defensive stats in here to odd shoppers, I do like DeMar DeRozan plus 290 for over 0.5 blocks. Anything at first glance that catches your eye?
So one of the things that I notice on Odd Shopper is that obviously the sports books are very, very good in general with these player prop projections. These lines are really, really solid all over the place. And honestly, especially in the points category, we don't really see our projections differ from most prop lines by more than a point or two, except for sometimes with the unders with star players. And this is one of the key differences when trying to play DFS versus betting. We can trust the math. We can trust the simulations. When a player like Giannis Antetokounmpo has a strong matchup, and I want all of him in the DFS world, but he has an expected win rate of under 31.5 points. He gets under 65% of the time. And the implied odds, minus 110. That implies basically a coin flip, 52% odds. That's an expected ROI of 24. I know it feels really icky to fade a star in a statistical category, but what I keep saying on these shows is you can still think he's going to have a tremendous game and still bet under, and you have a lot of room for error, right? He can still have 30 points and get the under for you. So that's where I'm going right now when I look at Odd Shopper.
Yeah. Also potential blowout in that game with the Milwaukee Bucks favored by 9.5 points right now over the Brooklyn Nets. Here's something else that I've kind of been contemplating. Me and one of my, not you, Matt, a different one of my friends, Matt, who I grew up with and is, I actually just did his podcast a few days ago, but has been my best friend since I was like 6 months old. Some of the games that are really one-sided, where we have props that already project for unders, I think it kind of makes sense to parlay same game parlays with a bunch of the unders. And then you get a chance where, hey, look, we're already projecting these to be positive bets. But then in the event you also get a blowout where the guys come off the court early, then you're also getting reduced minutes and just more likelihood of all those unders hitting at the same time. So something else that I'm kind of researching and keeping my eye on as a potential long-term thing to do. Still not something that I'm willing to invest a whole lot of money in, but just something kind of in the back of my head that's rolling around. What do you think of that logic?
I think that's great. I think that's sort of the flip side of the logic that our buddy Eric Lindquist had. He showed us he banked a really nice prize picks play yesterday where it was just a bunch of overs on player props. And then you can add the over on the game to that in a single game parlay situation. Again, your bet slip should tell a story, especially when you're doing a parlay that are putting them all together.
All right. So anything else that you really want to talk about from prop betting? Now we'll talk about the second half of these games today. Short slate, just 6 games to hit on.
I think I'm ready to roll. Definitely check out those blocks and steals bets, like these over 0.5, under 0.5. I think we have a huge edge there, as Greg was saying.
Yeah, it's a new addition to Odd Shopper, which once again is free to use over at awesemo.com. So you guys should be checking out that tool. Really useful. Next game on the slate to talk about, Memphis Grizzlies on the road against the Chicago Bulls. Memphis Grizzlies, this is how much respect this team is getting right now. Currently favored over Chicago, even though the Bulls are a team towards the top of the Eastern Conference. People are starting to mention DeMar DeRozan as being a potential MVP candidate. I don't buy it. I think he certainly is in the top 10 and is warranting of getting top 10 votes, top 5 votes. I don't think he's a better player than guys like Giannis Antetokounmpo, Nikola Jokic, or Joel Embiid. I don't think he's quite that caliber of player, but even despite all the love the Chicago Bulls are getting right now, Memphis favored on the road in Chicago. So we look at guys like Memphis, Ja Morant, one of the most expensive players over on Yahoo at $46. Triple J, Jaren Jackson Jr. is $29. What do you like from Memphis, who's maybe surprising to the public favorite on the road in Chicago?
Yeah, I get why the ownership is projected to be pretty low for Ja Morant, but did I see this correctly that right now his ownership projection is sub 10%? Like that, I get it. From a value perspective, 46 is really tough to get to. It kind of limits the things that you can do with the rest of your lineup. But again, tell yourself the story of the slate. If we come out of the slate and John Morant has a monster performance, and that's the reason someone took down a GPP, is anyone on earth surprised? No. Now, do I think that's the most likely thing here? I don't. You know, he looked beat up yesterday, in his last game. He came out of the lineup for a little bit, still ended up playing 35 minutes. But I was talking with a buddy about Morant specifically, and Morant kind of reminds me sometimes of the way that like Wade used to throw his body around, and he's constantly hitting the floor over and over and over as he's trying to continue to be aggressive. And that's great. That's why he racks up so much playing time and so much production on that playing time. But he's not my favorite tonight. I like Jaren Jackson Jr., a 21% boom percentage here at $29. He's a solid value play. I'll have some Desmond Bane as well at $23. Beyond that, not as exciting. It's always scary to say John Morant is someone I'm not super excited about, but I think I will actually be over the field if it ends up being sub 10%.
Yeah, so from a contrarian standpoint, I think you could make some logic to it, but at the same time too, there's a lot of stars on the slate I like getting to. Nikola Jokic is going to be the preeminent one for me that I really want to build my lineups around. And Trae Young is $40. John Morant is $46. I have Trae Young projected for more fantasy points. That's just going to make it hard for me to make that decision to go play John Morant. There's a lot of players that are cheaper than him. Well, I wouldn't say a whole lot. There's a couple of players that are cheaper than him that I have projected for more fantasy points. I mentioned Trae Young. We've got Domantas Sabonis being another one. It's going to be hard for me to get to John Morant. Another thing too, you know, just under 10% of lineups expected to have him in. It's contrarian, but it's not like it's crazy contrarian. And I still think there's a pretty good chance that somebody like Trae Young outscores him, and he's $6 less expensive. So that's going to be tough for me to pull the trigger on. But what about some of these other guys where we got Triple J, $29, Desmond Bane, $23, Steven Adams, $20. Do you view any of the other guys on Memphis as being strong options today?
Jackson's okay for me. As I said, he's got the solid boom percentage. We got him projected right at 29 minutes, which is about a minute more than his minutes per game average over his last 10. His projection of 1.23 fantasy points per minute is actually fifth among forwards on the slate. So that's kind of bullish. But at the same time, if he's going to have that type of efficiency on just 30 minutes of play, I'm very interested at $29. Steven Adams, less so. Again, we're talking about, I think the 10% boom percentage lets you know all you need to. Like, it's not impossible, but there are people who I believe have 2 or 3 times as likely a chance to be 5x, it's not 5x salary on Yahoo, but to be well above their salary-based expectations in production.
All right, so let's talk about the Chicago side of the game. And I want to hit on DeMar DeRozan here, who's become fairly expensive. He's now $46 over on Yahoo. And for reference, here are the players that are more expensive than DeMar DeRozan today: Nikola Jokic, Giannis Antetokounmpo, DeJounte Murray, end of list. That's it. DeMar DeRozan, he's had some crazy games lately. I believe he's only 2 games away, 2 more games of 35-plus points, and I believe he breaks Michael Jordan's Chicago Bulls record for most consecutive games as a Chicago Bull, scoring 35 or more points. He's been on a crazy run as of late, but at the same time, like I said, expensive now. $46, still projected for 11% ownership right now. Is DeMar DeRozan somebody you want to be paying up for with his salary on the rise?
Let's talk about some important numbers before I answer the question. I get it. 38.8 minutes per game over his last 10. That's number 1 on this slate among all forwards. 34.2% usage percentage over his last 10 game. That's number 1 among all forwards. We have him projected for 37 and a half minutes, and that's actually pretty low. If you ask me, that's that's a minute less than his last 10 game average. DeRozan is a beast, and I'm still not really going there. Less than a 20% boom percentage. I think the 11.2% ownership is fair, but something that I'm probably going to use the field as my guide here. I don't want to completely fade DeRozan the way he's been playing, but he is not my favorite play. I think he is overpriced, but it's one of those situations like I was talking about with Morant, where if you told me at the end of the night he was the reason somebody took down a GPP, we're not surprised. I'm trying to build in some exposure for players like that whenever I'm creating multiple lineups, but he's not my favorite based on salary-based expectations.
you have somebody who is your favorite as a pay up option on Chicago, or do none of them really stand out? As for DeRozan, there's something else to mention about DeRozan too before we go on. Well, he has been really good. He hasn't been relative to what his current salary is. Fantasy points in recent games: 50, 53, 51, 54, 54, 43, 53. These are all strong games, but not necessarily when somebody's $46, because now you're getting into a situation where, well, you need him to outscore Nikola Jokic probably. Jokic scores more than this basically every single night. Like, I mean, Jokic is somebody I'm regularly projecting for over 60 fantasy points. And that's something that DeRozan hasn't even touched as of late, even though we all know, as good as DeRozan is right now, it's going to fall off eventually. He's not going to continue to shoot, 60% from the field and score 35 real life points. But even with him doing all that, he still isn't scoring Nikola Jokic. So it's going to be hard for me to get there. But to circle back on the question I asked you before, if we don't really love the salary on DeMar DeRozan, how do you feel about Vooch at $41, Levine at $32? Either of those stars stand out to you?
Those were absolutely the two I was going to mention. And the big thing too, when we're forced to sort of make comparisons for DeRozan to players like Jokic because of salary, then we got to start thinking about team builds. Like, Chicago isn't built to have DeRozan completely lead this team in production. They want to spread out the production more than they're able to right now. And while the injuries to their backcourt continue, they're going to need DeRozan, but they absolutely want production from Vucevic and Levine here, who I was kind of scared the way that they were reporting his injury before the All-Star break, that this could go from bad to worse, but I'm happy to see him projected for over 34 minutes. That'd still be 4 minutes less than his 10-game average in minutes per game. We have a solid projection in terms of points per minute. Vucevic is still my favorite of those two, a 21% boom percentage and only a 6.2% ownership. I get it. He's expensive. I've always had a soft spot for Vooch, but I really like both of those players, honestly, especially if we're going to be fading DeRozan.
So the thing that I like the most about Zach LaVine is, even though there were concerns about the knee, he got a couple weeks off, which that could only be a positive thing considering that he was dealing with knee soreness. He played 36 minutes the first game back. And I tend to think that, considering the Bulls are at the top of the East, if Zach LaVine was not totally, like, this is going to be a team in the playoffs. There's no doubt about that. If LaVine was not totally healthy, I just don't think they'd be, number one, I don't think they'd be playing him at all, but I certainly don't think they'd be playing him 36 minutes. So these, to me, I'm just kind of reading the tea leaves. 36 minutes last game, that's a positive indication. I don't know we totally trust the knee, and this is just based on the eye test. He appeared to be attacking less in the last game the Bulls played and was taking a lot of kind of contested step back jumpers. I think that was him maybe a little bit unsure about how his knee feels, but he's $32. And that is a depressed price point for Zach LaVine. And also keep in mind, no Lonzo Ball, no Alex Caruso in the backcourt. But Zach LaVine, you don't have to go back very far to find him as a $39 player over on Yahoo. That was only about a month ago. So I think this is a good point to buy low on Zach LaVine. I said the same thing on the strategy show, and I was talking about it being $7,800 on FanDuel tonight. So Zach LaVine, I think, is a good tournament dart play. Any of the role players here stand out to you? Dosunmu, $22, $14 for Javonte Green. Do you think any of these guys are worth saving salary with?
Dosunmu is the only one with a boom percentage of in the double digits. He's in that sort of no man's land at $22 in salary. Because of the way the point guard position is tonight on the slate, we've got some obvious value options at $10, $11, and then we've got a ton of high salary premium options. So I'm not getting to a lot of mid-range players. I guess that would be the one if I had to say one on this team.
All right, then let's move on to the Brooklyn Nets on the road against the Milwaukee Bucks. Now, because of the situation where Kyrie Irving isn't allowed to play in home games, and also because of the All-Star break, we have not seen Kyrie Irving play in quite some time. The last time that Kyrie Irving played a basketball game, February 12th. So we've gone 2 weeks without seeing Kyrie Irving play. I think that has to disrupt your rhythm at some point as an NBA player, where it's just like, hey, I'm playing a game and I'm sitting out for a couple of weeks, playing a couple of games, sitting out for another few days. I don't really think that's ideal. I guess it's good for keeping Kyrie healthy, but the Nets have won, I think it's like 1 game in the last 5 weeks now, or something along those lines. Maybe it's 2 games, but it hasn't been so 2 games in the last 5 weeks the Nets have won. Not ideal. But now we're getting Kyrie Irving back in the picture. That would seem to benefit them from a game-winning standpoint, but they're on the road in Milwaukee, biggest underdogs on the slate right now. It's a bit of an issue for the Nets considering the matchup, and they still don't have Kevin Durant. Ben Simmons, no clue when he's going to be making his debut with the team. $39 though for Kyrie Irving. What do you make of him at that salary, and how much does a potential blowout risk maybe scare you away?
So this is just impossible. When you're using like data-based models that use historical data, it is just impossible to factor in the loss of rhythm that you're kind of talking about. But I absolutely think that is a valid way to think about this. Again, it's sort of like we were saying at the top of the show, Greg, this just adds to the variability. And the other thing, when you don't have Kyrie Irving in the lineup, and it is one of the more popular players in the NBA, I think it actually inflates the projected ownership as well, because people just want to play him. I could see Kyrie having a great game in a losing effort here. I think that happens often if you run this game over and over again. I don't really think the Nets have the firepower right now at all to stick with Milwaukee, but Kyrie does have a 40-point game in him and a 50-point fantasy game in him for sure. We've got him projected for 42 points in 36 minutes of play right now. That's pretty solid in terms of points per minute. He's actually fifth among all guards in projected points per minute. So he's not a bad play at all. Again, it's just one of those where he is going to be pretty popular. Like a quarter of lineups are going to have him. And again, the variability is just really increased here. I don't know what to make of how good Kyrie will be tonight.
Yeah, and then I think somebody else who's relevant to talk about when we're talking about Kyrie Irving is that Seth Curry's played a very big role for the Brooklyn Nets in recent games. With Kyrie Irving out of the mix, we've seen Seth Curry with the ball in his hands more than when he was in Philadelphia. He's been the primary facilitator for the Nets. We've also seen his usage rate spike, but now he remains cheap, only $19 on Yahoo. But Kyrie Irving's back in the mix. So individually, I still project Seth Curry well, but where do you stand on him when he's expected to be one of the more popular plays on the slate? We currently have him projected to be in, where was that number? Still projected to be in 19% of the field's lineup, but Kyrie Irving's back in the mix. So how much do you think that's going to take away from Seth Curry? Do you still want to get exposure to him?
I kind of do. Honestly, somebody other than Kyrie is going to have to score. And this is sort of the drum I've been beating for basically since this Harden-Simmons trade is while the Nets are so beat up, just somebody needs to put the ball in the basket for the Nets, even to keep them competitive. Curry is probably going to get the green light to shoot enough that I want exposure to him in GPPs. Obviously, his chances of being a fantasy dominant player are way, way lower when Kyrie's on the court, but it's not impossible. His boom percentage is still up around 17%. His $19 salary is reasonable considering his median projection, still around 30 fantasy points over at Yahoo. I'll take my chances on him.
And then anything else from the Nets here you want to talk about? I hate Steve Nash's rotations. They are garbage for fantasy. We'll see somebody start and play 12 minutes. We'll see some random guy come off the bench and play a bunch of minutes. Bruce Brown will start and score 35 fantasy points. Then he'll start the next game and it'll be like, oh, I want to play Bruce Brown again. Then he plays 16 minutes and scores 5 fantasy points. Impossible to nail down. So I think there's ultimately going to be better value plays I feel more confident in, that I don't really want to play these other Nets guys. But is there somebody you want to try to talk me into that I'm overlooking?
I don't know. $11 James Johnson. I don't know. Maybe. I don't think so. We probably can just move on. If you're talking about trying to take down the largest of large field tournaments, you could look here, but I'm probably just keeping it pretty tight here with the Nets.
All right, so let's talk about the other side of the game then. And Giannis Antetokounmpo, always a strong pay-up option with upside. But here's where I think we have to compare him to. We have to compare him to Nikola Jokic today because it's not really going to be that viable to build lineups that have both Jokic and Giannis in them. And ultimately, then I just look at my projections and I have Jokic project for more than 10 more fantasy points than Giannis Antetokounmpo. With that being the case, I find it hard to say that Giannis is a priority for me because I want Jokic to be the priority if I'm spending up. Do you feel differently when it comes to comparing Giannis to Jokic, or do you have a different take on the situation entirely?
Sorry to be so in agreement with you here, but that's kind of how I'm reading it as well. No one's surprised if Giannis ends up taking down, helping someone take down a GPP. Literally, no one is surprised. But there is a reason why Jokic's ownership is projected to be higher. And the Awesemo tools bear out the upside comparatively is so much in Jokic's favor. I think in terms of boom percentage right now, Jokic is nearly double of what Giannis is. So even considering the same exact salary-based expectations, Jokic just has such a higher ceiling. You got to say he's the better play straight up. Again, we're not telling you to not play Giannis. That's not what we're saying. And even though I was talking about the under here, we're not saying like if you're trying to take down a GPP and be contrarian, he's not a bad play, but the numbers say he is worse compared to Jokic.
Yeah, and it's not even like he's that contrarian. We have him projected to be in 20% of the field's lineup. So, I'd feel different if we were getting 5% 5% Giannis, then I'd be looking at him, oh, this is a contrarian play. We want to try to capture that upside, but the field's already there. And as for the other guys in Milwaukee, Drew Holiday, Chris Middleton, I think they're a little bit overpriced right now because we've seen a lot of games where Giannis has been out of the picture over the last few weeks. As a result, $34 for Drew Holiday, $33 for Chris Middleton, $26 for Bobby Portis. None of these guys really stand out to me. And then also we have to consider the blowout risk also potentially being an issue. If I was playing 150 lineups on Yahoo, I don't think I'd be more than a few lineups of Holiday, Middleton, Portis, very low priority plays. Do you like any of these guys and feel differently, or where do you stand on the Holiday Middleton combo and Portis as well?
Yeah, so if you look at that trio or those four, I guess Portis is actually one that is kind of interesting simply because his projected ownership is sub 4% right now. And his boom percentage at 12% is essentially the same as his teammates, same as Chris Middleton. Obviously, these are comparing it to salary-based expectations, but the same as Middleton, the same as Drew Holiday. So I guess if it's one, it's the $26 Bobby Portis salary that kind of interests me the most because so little of the field is looking that way.
All right, let's move on to the final game of the slate. And we have the Sacramento Kings against the Denver Nuggets. Not only is it the last game of the slate, but also the game, one of the games with the highest total. Actually, the Memphis-Chicago game has now surpassed it in total. Early in the day when I was doing the show, I believe Denver-Sacramento had the highest total of the slate. But that aside, Sacramento-Denver, very high total in this game. Starting with the Sacramento side, I love getting to Domantas Sabonis here. He's only $40, and we're seeing him play the role with Sacramento that he played a couple of years ago with the Indiana Pacers, where a lot of the offense flows through him. He plays more of a point forward role. He facilitates a lot of the offense. As a result, 13 assists across his last two games. We're starting to see Sabonis operate in a little bit more space, and the minutes are also there for him. Last two games, Domantas Sabonis, 37 minutes in each of those games. You go back to some of his workloads earlier in the season with the Indiana Pacers, the playing time just wasn't quite there. So overall for the season, I think we're now looking at him on the Kings as just being a guy who gets a boost because the more of the offense goes through him. But then number two, there's also more playing time available for Sabonis. I think the $40 is a misprice, especially considering the pace of play in this game. Sabonis is one of my favorite options on the slate. I love De'Aaron Fox too at $32. I think this is a great game to target. But it's hard for me to prioritize anybody on Sacramento outside of Sabonis and Fox, because then we have guys like Harrison Barnes, Davion Mitchell, Jeremy Lamb, Dante DiVincenzo, and I just don't love any of them for what their current salaries are. Fox and Sabonis, I love both of them. What do you like from the Kings?
Yeah, I like Fox fine, but Sabonis is the one that sticks out to me. The exact same reasoning is what I got to. And honestly, I saw the Awesemo projections at 34.3 minutes. I think that might actually be a little conservative. That's 2.5 minutes more per game than his previous 10 games. Obviously, that includes the 2 games that he's had with his new team as well. I think the usage percentage could continue to increase, and our points per minute projection for Sabonis at 1.27 actually, I think that's actually conservative as well. I know more playing time can sometimes mean slightly lower points per minute, but he had higher points per minute over the last 10 games and over the season as well, 1.35 over the season and 1.46 points per minute over his last 10 games. I think Sabonis is a really strong play. De'Aaron Fox is fine for me. His boom percentage is basically equal to his projected ownership. I would like to see him a little less popular, but at $32, I think he's a solid value. I certainly like him. I'm trying to look at these other players here. I had a little bit of interest in Justin Holiday at $11. That's okay. Yeah, Harrison Barnes okay as well, but you're right. It really is Sabonis and Fox and sort of everybody else.
Yeah, and then one other note that I'm going to mention before we talk about Nikola Jokic and the Denver Nuggets is when the Kings flipped Tyrese Halliburton to bring in Domantas Sabonis, it was a very clear indication this team is trying to win now. And I think just based on that trade and what I think the organizational goals are, anything short of making the playoffs or making it to the play-in game at least is going to be considered a failure. So for that reason, I think we could pretty safely project more minutes for Sabonis and Fox down the stretch of the season, especially when we have back-to-back games with Sabonis playing 37 minutes. So I'm in agreement with you. I think our minutes projection is a little bit conservative based on what we've seen the last couple of games from Sabonis. And also, I'm just trying to figure out what I think the organizational goals are for the Sacramento Kings right now. Now, talking about the Denver Nuggets, if you have the salary cap to pay for Nikola Jokic, roster him. If you don't have the salary cap to roster Nikola Jokic, make the salary cap to play Nikola Jokic. I have him as the top overall play on the slate by a very, very wide margin. And I just don't see any way around it. If Nikola Jokic is on a slate, he should be your highest projected player. If not, it's either some really crazy slate or you've made an error somewhere. I like Jokic. Do you have any counterpoint to that?
Giannis is capable of outscoring Jokic if you play the slate over and over again. That's literally the only counterpoint. Jokic is breaking fantasy basketball. He's unbelievable. He's amazing to watch. Get him in your lineup.
Yep, that's where I'm at too. I have him projected for a lot more fantasy points than Giannis. And the only guy in recent slates that I had projected comparably to Jokic was Joel Embiid. But number one, Joel Embiid isn't on the slate today. Number two, James Harden's in the mix for the Philadelphia 76ers now as well, which is going to limit some of the usage for Embiid on future slates. It's just always going to be Jokic as my preferred pay-up option, unless something changes with his salary. He's $12,000 on DK. He's $56 on Yahoo. It's not enough. And I don't think sites are going to go up and start pricing at $14,000. He probably should be, but that's just not where I envision him getting. Role players on the Denver Nuggets. Zeke Naji is questionable. We've got Will Barton with a reasonable price tag, Aaron Gordon with a reasonable price tag. If Naji is out, I actually really do like Gordon a bunch here at $20. I think he could play a couple extra minutes. But individually, Barton and Gordon, I think, are both strong options if we're looking for mid-range plays. Where do you stand with the rest of this Denver team?
I actually like that call on Gordon. The one I was going to talk about was Barton. We got him projected for 31 minutes here, which I think is actually possibly a little conservative and about a point per minute in terms of our projection. He's fine at $21. Again, he's just a really good salary saving option. And I don't mind a little correlation with Jokic. Just if we're going to be so bullish on him, I don't mind having a second player on there. So Barton is probably my favorite. Gordon is decent. I like him more than players like Morris or Jeff Green for sure. After that, it gets pretty slim.
Yeah, I don't really think there's anybody else to look at here. Monty Morris, he's had some decent games as of late, but this is also a healthier Denver Nuggets team than we saw prior to the deadline. I know, or prior to the All-Star break, I know Zeke Naji is currently questionable, but even with that taken aside, we've got guys like Austin Rivers, Bryn Forbes, Bones Highland, Monty Morris. These guys are all healthy. When more often than not, we had one or two of those guys out a little bit before the All-Star break. That is going to do it for us today, guys. A lot of content coming up on the YouTube channel. We're going to be covering the NBA slate, obviously. Deeper Dive Live before lock later. Also, the MMA strategy show, NHL strategy show. Check out all of that. Like this video. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Good luck. Have a great weekend.